Well, let me thank you for taking your valuable time to participate in what is our 14th legislative briefing. For 12 years, we've tried to cover as many bills related to marriage, family, life, and religious liberty as we could in the time that we had allowed, about 40 minutes plus time for question and answer. And we would try to give some worldview perspective on the ones that we thought were most important. Then last year we really changed things up quite a bit by putting the whole briefing in the context of a worldview perspective. And then we looked at bills related to that worldview perspective that we thought were most important. And this year will be different still. After the Georgia Senate elections on January 5th and the transition that took place in the White House, some things I believe have become more apparent. Sort of like the transition from the Old Testament glass darkly revelations of the Messiah to what we now see in Christ that was revealed in the New Testament books of the Bible. And what this change that we've seen means in terms of our state government and the state legislature is correspondingly less clear for reasons I'll explain. As I've said before, I'm not really sure I know what to anticipate in this General Assembly in light of the nature of the changes that have taken place in our country. But I do need to say, I don't think we'll be able to understand what our legislature and our governor are doing or not doing that they should be doing. In other words, we won't know how to judge the legislation and policy issues being debated. And here's the key, and the implications of the way they are being debated if we don't understand the nature of the problem that's actually before us. As a friend said to me on Facebook after January 6th, David, is the Republic lost? What can we do? And so I've been doing a podcast I would invite you to go back and listen to. It started in January called Hope and Purpose at God, Law, and Liberty. And we just had an excellent guest, Andrew Sandlin, on the podcast that was posted last Friday. But here's my point for today in which I want to put the context of things. If we don't diagnose the situation correctly, then the solutions we apply will not be effective. And worse yet, when those hoped-for solutions prove ineffective and the current trajectory does not change, then there will be even more despair. Also, by way of preparatory remarks, I will mention some statements made by some high-ranking state politicians in regard to some legislation that I think are valuable for us to look at in order to understand the worldviews that are at play. It's not my intent to embarrass these persons, nor to comment or call into question any issue of their justification before God. Every day, if every sin I commit were cause to doubt my justification before God, I would be hopelessly despairing. So please understand that. Some of the things that I will comment on are things that I myself have to admit I was guilty of. So they come out of my own experience and God searching my own heart, rather than me so much criticizing the heart of another. So they're born of my own critical evaluation of my own worldview and my own worldview approach to politics and to enacting or defeating legislation. So with that being said, what is the situation with which we're now confronted after the events of the last election cycle? And it's in that context we will then look at some legislation and evaluate whether it is actually directed at the situation with the possibility of altering the trajectory. In this regard, I want us to take a look at the comments of a gentleman that I have grown to love, even though he's been deceased for well over 100 years. It's a man by the name of Abraham Kuyper. You've heard me mention him often in our podcast. I write about him in my commentaries. Abraham Kuyper is an interesting gentleman because he was so convinced of the calling of Christians to be salt and light in every sphere of the created order, as an expression of the image of God placed upon us as part of the creation, in charge of the creation. He founded newspapers. He founded the Free University of Amsterdam. He wrote commentaries on the Bible, multi-volume commentaries. He founded a political party called the Anti-Revolutionary Party and became the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. There are times I wonder how he was not two people at the same time. But some of the things I'm going to share that he said today are so germane to our current situation and to understanding it. And there was a Congress in 1891 called the First Christian Congress on the Social Question. And the Protestant nations, we would probably still say the Reformed nations of Europe, pulled together to look at the increase of social democracy coming out of France and the root principle of no God, no master, and the effect that was now having in the rest of Europe and the push towards socialist structures. Now, if you don't see that we have a push towards socialist structures and a social democratization where nobody can say anything to anybody and we're all against each other and everybody is supposed to somehow be leveled, then you might want to just turn off if you don't have any inkling that some of those things are bubbling out there, okay? And so he spoke to them, and what he said, I think, was so germane to diagnose our problem, and then we will look at how we're doing in addressing that problem. Now, here's what he said, that Europe was facing what he called a social question. And here is how he defined what a social question was. The term social question means, in the most general sense, that serious doubt has arisen about the soundness of the social structure in which we live. That public opinion is divided as to the type of foundation on which a more appropriate and more livable social order may be built. Now, he said a social question exists for you. Now, it doesn't exist for everybody. But you know that a social question exists for you if you realize the untenability of the present situation. In other words, can we continue with this sense of political correctness, cancel culture, storming the walls of the Capitol, burning cities? Can we continue? Is that tenable? Then you might have a social question. But he said for it to really be a social question, you have to realize it's not one of incidental causes, but involves the very basis of our social association. How do we think of ourselves as a society, as a community, as people living in community? Now he said a social question does not exist for you. So now you can check yourself on the antithesis of that by saying, if you think the evil can be exorcised through an increase in piety or friendlier treatment or kinder charity, then you don't think we have a social question. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, if you continue to read his speech, you would see that he'd say a religious question might be the belief that we can elect more Christians. You know, if we'll just elect more Christians to political office, then that will solve the problem. We just don't have enough Christians. We don't have enough statesmen. Then you think we have a religious problem. Or maybe if you think if we just re-elect Donald Trump, that would have solved everything. Then you think we have just a religious question. A philanthropic question is what he's really talking about here with friendlier treatment and kinder charity. You know, if we were just more generous. Or maybe if we just had more government funding for our programs. Then you don't think we really have a social problem. It can be fixed with money. It can be fixed by electing more Christians, more AOCs, more whatever it is you think it is that we need. And he says, therefore, you really think all we have is a religious question, possibly a philanthropic question, but not a social question. See, I would suggest to you that there's a sense in which that it is really more than a religious question, as we'll see. It's the very foundation of our society. And so Kuyper says this, when you see deterioration so widespread, it suggests the presence of a general cause. And this cause must be sought in the ideas which have predominated. Nothing other than probably what many of you believe, that ideas do have consequences. And so when we see that these problems are not isolated to the south, or just to the north, or just to the east, or just to the west, but that they spread across a whole nation, across the whole social order, when you don't anymore trust in the media, you don't trust in the Congress, you don't trust in the Supreme Court that won't hear cases that are vitally important, when you see your state legislature ducking on issues year after year, you begin to see this isn't just a problem in Tennessee or the South or one place. It's widespread. And so what are the ideas that have been affected? So he says this, so don't be deceived by appearances. This is not about material interest. If you really think this is about income inequality, he's saying, then you don't really see the nature of the problem of a social question. That can be addressed, see, by more philanthropy, greater charity. It's not about national interest. Don't we see a lot of that now? Nationalism. America, make America great, versus Europe great, or European Union. He says, no. That's not what it's really about. It's not about forms of government. Well, if we could just, have a different form of government, if we could change the Constitution so that he said, don't be deceived by that. It's not differences between confessions of faith. Now, that to me was the most striking thing, because the church has been known throughout history to have great conflicts over questions of confession. I mean, let's just be honest about it. We had the Catholic Church, and then we had Luther. Well, that was a dispute over confessions. How far Pelagian do we want to be versus Augustinian do we want to be? And then Luther left it within the reforming of the church. Calvin took it to reforming of all of society and the sovereignty of God over all of creation, not just within the church. So that began to change things further. Then you had the Anabaptists, right, who came along that sort of were a pushback against the Reformation. We've had huge clashes over confessions of faith. But it wasn't the point where we didn't believe there was a God who was in the beginning, who created. You see, we're now in a society, as Kuyper later told the seminarians at Princeton in 1898, you will not avoid the problems of Europe because you're no longer hermetically sealed off by the oceans. And we are no longer even in a pagan society that believes in God and gods, but in a society that believes it has moved past such beliefs as if it is outdated. And that's a different environment. And then he says this, let alone is this really a struggle between the spirit of conservation and the spirit of progress. In other words, this isn't about liberals and conservatives. And we're going to see that in just a moment. It's about shades of gray on the same root principle. Here's what he said. It is about resisting or obeying the God of the gospel. Human pride desires its own sovereignty and remakes religion. Think of the comments about Obama and Hillary Clinton. Christianity needs to adjust to where we are today, has to remake society, and if it won't be in the image of God, it will have to be in the image of man or beast, or tree, or flower. Oh, we see Romans chapter 1. It is bent on destroying all that itself has not created or sanctioned. What about the attack on history? See, that's really the root question. Now, here's what I'm going to say that I hate to have to say, but in the 27 years that I've been there, I have concluded after January the 6th that what we have seen going place in our country and how it worked itself out in the polls, and I'm not just referring to the presidential election, that the type of foundation on which our current social order exists has already changed from that on which our social structures, including the U.S. Constitution, were originally built. In other words, there's a sense in which you could say, we are not now engaged in saving the Christian heritage. We have lost it. It's about recovering one. And that's different.